Hey, thanks so much for joining me again. This is Gary Zacharias, and you're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. Here's a book that I haven't done before, and it's been sitting on my shelf for some time. It's called Is God Just a Human Invention? And 17 Other Questions Raised by the New Atheists. And so this is a reaction to the whole new atheist boom that happened in the early 2000s. This book came out in 2010, so it's been around a while. Sean McDowell and Jonathan Morrow, two good authors, are the co-authors. And actually, they are authors and they're editorial people. They put together other good authors. So we've got Greg Kokel, John Warwick Montgomery does a chapter, Gary Habermas. Wow, he's amazing. He's so good on the resurrection. William Dembski has a chapter, Doug Guyvet, Fuzz Rana from Reasons to Believe, Jay Richards, Gary DeWeese. I mean, they got some great, Frank Turek, Paul Copan writes some things there, Doug Groteis. Let's see, Randy Alcorn, Daryl Bach. So they've got all these wonderful authors that introduce their own comments as well. And the chapters, I mean, these are some amazing questions that they struggle with, or Christians struggle with, like the problem of evil, what good is Christianity? Is God a genocidal bully? Does God intend for us to keep slaves? Look at the Old Testament. Are miracles possible? Is Darwinian evolution the only game in town? And on and on and on. So this is a really good book. It said the question of God is up for public debate, and the new atheists want you to question your faith. So McDowell and Morrow know that there is solid evidence for God and Christianity. And so they have all sorts of, they examine all sorts of challenges here. Dan Kimball says, these are the questions we can't ignore today. Sean and Jonathan guide us to see unshakable truth in the midst of what can feel like unnerving and scary questions. Yeah. Craig Hazen, I like him a lot. He is the founder and director of the MA program in Christian apologetics at Biola. Now he's working with Stand to Reason. He says, this is a book to buy for all of your skeptical coworkers, neighbors, or family members. Then challenge them to meet with you weekly as you work through the chapters. They and you will never be the same. And I think that's true. So I'm going to pick a chapter of a really uncomfortable topic. Most Christians don't want to bring it up. They don't want to think about it. And it bothers a lot of people in our society. It's chapter 12. And here's the title. Is Hell a Divine Torture Chamber? And Sam Harris, they start Sam Harris. Now, he's one of those new atheists. He said, if you think that Jesus taught only the golden rule and love of one's neighbor, you should reread the New Testament. Pay particular attention to the morality that will be on display when Jesus returns to earth, trailing clouds of glory. So they start off and they say, hell's one of those topics you really don't bring up in polite conversation. But they said in a recent poll, 70% of Americans believe in it. This says, of course, what they believe in is probably going to be a little fuzzy. And said they may have all sorts of bizarre ideas that came around from urban legends and fire and brimstone preachers and bad horror films. That says, now take the new atheists, right? You got Christopher Hitchens, you got Richard Dawkins. What did they have to say? Well, here's Hitchens. Not until the advent of the Prince of Peace do we hear of the ghastly idea of further punishing and torturing the dead. Nothing proves the man-made character of religion as obviously as the sick mind that designed hell. Hitchens says the doctrine of hell is used to frighten children with pornographic descriptions of eternal torture. What does Richard Dawkins have to say? Well, he doesn't want to be taught by Hitchens, so he says the extreme horribleness of hell. Is that a word, horribleness? Anyway, the extreme horribleness of hell is portrayed by priests and nuns as inflated to compensate for its implausibility. If hell were plausible, it would only have to be moderately unpleasant in order to deter. Given that it's so unlikely to be true, it has to be advertised as very, very scary indeed. So he says, and I say he, this would be they really, because it's McDowell and Morrow. They said people really are uncomfortable with the idea of hell, definitely. And they said, we don't like the idea of hell either. But he says it doesn't follow from this sentiment that hell, if you really understand it, it doesn't follow that if we don't like it, that it must be false or inhumane or unjust or outdated or incoherent or implausible. So They said the point of Christianity, as far as thinking about hell, is not to avoid hell, but to enjoy God now and forever. Next section of the chapter here. The most virtuous man who ever lived taught the reality of hell. See, that's something a lot of people don't think about. They picture sweet, gentle Jesus holding children and feeding people and things like that. But as they point out in this section here, do you know who talked more about hell than anyone else in the Bible? Jesus. The same man who taught people how to do unto others and things like that said he didn't balk, he didn't stutter when it came to the topic of hell. Jesus didn't see any contradiction between the offer of love and forgiveness on the one hand and the reality of hell as a place of eternal punishment on the other. So that we can capture Jesus' teachings on hell in 3 images. Here's the first. He spoke of eternal fire and eternal punishment. On another occasion, he talked of hell as a place of darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now finally, he talked of the destruction of the soul. Wow. So Jesus thought this was so important. I mean, he brought it up more than once. Well, here comes the question, of course, as they mentioned in the title of the chapter. Is hell a fiery torture chamber? Are people going to be endlessly burning alive? It said, let's talk about the fire. It says we have to remember a really key part about communication. Every type of communication has rules, and you've got to understand those rules if the message is going to be interpreted correctly. So if you go to the sports page, they say, and it says the Tennessee Titans killed the Dallas Cowboys. No, they just scored more points. Or if somebody says, you're driving me crazy, well, that's not really a mental breakdown, at least you hope not. So these are figures of speech or figurative language. And they said, go to Jesus now. Think about how he communicated to his first century Jewish audience. He used something called hyperbole. Now, I'm an English teacher, so I'm familiar with that term. It's all through the Bible, by the way. It's not just Jesus. It's in the Psalms. It's in the early chapters of the Bible. There's a lot of hyperbole. Anyway, so that's how Jesus communicated. That's exaggeration. Now, why do you exaggerate? Isn't that lying? No. But it jolts people. It makes them pay attention. It makes them grasp the big idea. It's kind of like grabbing them and kind of shaking them. So think about Jesus. What did he say in one place? If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, he can't be my disciple. Well, if you read that literally, you're going, wow, I got to hate my parents to become a Christian. No. His followers to love their parents and even take the more radical step of loving enemies. Though what Jesus was trying to get across was the most important relationship in life was to be with God. That was the priority. So it said, you can take the Bible seriously without having to read it in a real hyper-literal, overly rigid way. So now let's come back to that issue. What about the fire? Well, it says the images like fire and darkness are metaphors to represent the indescribable. This is just the way language is used. So he says, I keep wanting to say he, so McDowell and Morrow say, it'd be tempting to think, okay, well, if it's just, indescribable, then maybe hell isn't really all that bad if there's no fire there. But they're saying it's actually, the reality be worse than the symbol. Fire speaks to an eternal spiritual decomposition of a person. So if heaven is where you become fully human, then hell is a place where you're fully disintegrating. You're coming apart for what it means to be human. The darkness refers to the complete absence of relationship. So it said the whole essence of hell is relational. He said we've been bombarded with images of flames and devils with pitchforks. But the Apostle Paul taught that hell is a place where people pay the penalty of eternal destruction away from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his power. So where's the anguish coming from? Why are the people in hell, in a sense, tortured? It's not God roasting them. It's the awareness that floods in that they don't have this fundamental relationship. So Tim Keller, for example, talks about hell in relational terms here. He says the biblical picture is that sin separates us from the presence of his God, from presence of God. If you lose God's presence totally, Keller says that would be hell. That's the loss of our ability to give or to receive any kind of love or joy. So next section of this chapter here says, it's not a question of God sending us to hell. That's what we always hear. It's that inside something is growing inside of us that's not good, and it'll be hell unless it's nipped in the bud. That's what C.S. Lewis says. So back to the two authors there, McDowell and Morrow, everyone is becoming something. We're on our way to become something. We're either going to be lovers of ourselves or a lover of God. We make our choices, and then we make those choices. They make us too. And again, they quote from Keller one more time. Keller says, even in this life, you can see soul disintegration that self-centeredness creates. It says, you know how selfishness and being self-absorbed, it leads to piercing bitterness and envy and anxiety and paranoid thoughts. So then Keller says, ask the question, what if when we die, we don't end, but spiritually our life extends on into eternity? So hell is, according to Keller, the trajectory of a soul living a self-absorbed, self-centered life going on and on forever. So McDowell and Morrow say, well, if God sees where this is going, couldn't he have stopped us? Couldn't he block the consequences of our actions so we wouldn't end up in hell? Well, yeah, he could. I mean, God can do that, but they point out only if he removes freedom and human dignity. So we are here to have a relationship with our Creator. And so to have the possibility of a relationship, we have a choice to love or not to love. So he said, now we have the resources to help us make sense of another question. Who in their right mind would knowingly choose hell? But he said, people ask for hell every day. They call it distance from God. They want to be left alone. They want to live life on their own terms. C.S. Lewis sums it up this way, they say, there are only two kinds of people in the end, those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, in the end, thy will be done. All that are in hell choose it. So the two authors say, people often think that hell isn't fair, but what could be fairer than giving people the outcome that they want? Now, here are some specific questions that they bring up, and they're trying to deal with. Did God create hell? So it said everything that God created was good, but when God created people with the ability to choose, then he created the possibility of evil, and by extension, the possibility of hell. It's God's fallback position, in a sense. Think of it this way. When people founded the U.S., they didn't start out by creating jails. They'd rather have a society without jails, but they were forced to come up with them because people wouldn't cooperate. And the same is true of hell. Here's another question. Does God torture dead people in hell? Christopher Hitchens, one of the new atheists, has this picture of God as the divine sadist out there roasting people over open flames. Well, is that true? Does God actually inflict pain on people in hell for eternity? Nowhere in the Bible does it indicate that. It's inconsistent with what the Bible says. Think about this. Here's a verse. Do I take any pleasure in the death of the wicked, declares the sovereign Lord. Rather, I am not pleased when they turn from their ways and live. I take no pleasure in the death of anyone. So God doesn't inflict torture on people. He doesn't do that any more than a judge who inflicts torture on his prisoners. A judge sentences criminals for what they chose to do. So the people who find themselves in hell have very actively sought to be away from the presence of God. Now, the anguish that they're going to experience in hell, that's their own design. It comes out of their own actions, their own characteristics, their own regrets. So I think that makes sense. Here's another question. Does God send children to hell? Well, there's biblical precedent to believe there's something called the age of accountability, in which children who die go directly to God's presence. For example, in Isaiah 7, it mentions a period before a child is morally accountable to God. In other words, before a child knows how to reject the wrong and to choose the right thing. And we get the idea of what God thinks about kids. Think about what Jesus says. Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. On another occasion, Jesus says, it's not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones perish. So, as McDowell and Morrow point out, from a Christian perspective, we have good reason to affirm that no children will be in hell. Here's another question. If God is loving, why can't he just forgive everyone? Well, to condone an evil is simply to ignore it, to treat it like it's good. Well, that would violate the goodness of God if he just looked the other way. J.I. Packer, he's a theologian, he said, would a God who put no distinction between the beasts of history, like Hitler's and Stalin's, and his own saints, would he be morally praiseworthy and perfect? No, absolutely not. Says the issue is, how do we understand God's wrath as described in the Bible? How can wrath be consistent with love? And why is God so angry at sin? It said, let's make this personal. Have you ever seen someone you love taken advantage of or harmed? What was your response? Well, if you're a normal person, you get really outraged, don't you? You get angry. And so God's wrath is not just a cranky old man getting upset. It's his opposition to what sin has done to all of us. It's eating us up as humans. And he loves us, and he hates to see that happen. Here's another question. Why does hell have to last forever? Says, if hell is forever, that seems to be what Jesus taught, then why? If you're just sinning in this world just for a lifetime, let's say 80 years, how can you end up in an eternity in hell, right? How did you earn that? That punishment doesn't seem to fit the crime. Well, they have a couple of responses. One, people continue to sin in hell. I mean, that's possible, isn't it? Their rebellion hasn't stopped. They still don't want God, and they're still shaking their fists at him. So that's one possibility why it goes on forever. Here's another idea. Their rebellion against an infinite God warrants an eternal debt to be paid. So that seems useful too. So this is beginning to wrap up the chapter here, and I like their ending here. They said any discussion of hell from a Christian perspective would be incomplete and inadequate without acknowledging that Jesus experienced hell on earth. I mean, think about him when he was on the cross. My God, why are you forsaking me? While he's being crucified. He was out of the presence of God. He was taking on the sins of this world. So they said that the cross stands as a reminder that this hellish existence after this life is not the only option. It doesn't have to be this way. We can turn. We can change our minds. Jesus' word for this is repentance. So the gospel is good news, isn't it? It's a declaration that hell is not God's desire for anyone. Yeah, that's good. Now, at the very end of the chapter, I like what they do. They let somebody mentions every chapter has a different person having a take on whatever the topic happened to be. So in this case, Frank Turek, who's founder and president of crossexamine.org, he's also an author of a really wonderful book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. He's all over the place. He's on college campuses. He has a TV program, radio program. Great speaker. He's spoken to our church and did an excellent job. I love Frank Turek. That's Turek if you want to look up some of his material. So he has just a page and a half titled Why Hell is Loving and Necessary. So this is Turek talking now. He said, I often doubted the existence of hell. It bothered him a lot. But he said, the more that he thought about it, hell seemed to him not only fair but necessary. So he said, let me ask you a couple of questions. Have you ever been abused or insulted or exploited? You ever been victimized? Well, sure. I mean, think how bad it is. He said, how do you feel when the culprits get away with it, when the guilty escape justice? So he said, we all want justice. He said, if there's no afterlife, there's no ultimate justice. Some of the people that committed the most horrific acts in history don't get punished. Hitler experiences nothing. He's in the arms of his mistress, shoots himself, and he's done. Stalin dies in bed. He said, we got millions of murderers, rapists, child abusers. They're never going to get their just desserts if there's no hell. But if there is a God, then hell is necessary for people like this. He said, all right, but what about just the average non-believer? Why hell for them? And he said, I've debated Christopher Hitchens a couple of times. And by the way, they have at least one I know of. One of the debates is on, I can't remember if it's DVD or CD, but it'd be really good for a small group to hear Hitchens and Frank Turek talk about the existence of God. They have a wonderful discussion about that. And I think if you watch that or listen to it, you'll find that Hitchens has just emotional points and no arguments. And Turek is the one who provides scientific and philosophical and historical evidences. So that's kind of interesting. Anyway, so he said he's debated Christopher Hitchens. He said, I can tell you he's no Hitler or Stalin. He says, but Hitchens admits he doesn't want to go to heaven, even if it exists. Why? Well, for Hitchens, heaven would be just hell to him. He doesn't want to be in God's presence here on earth. Why would he want to be with God in eternity? He wants separation from God, and that's what he's going to get. That's what hell is. God gives us that free will, so Hitchens can reject him and shake his fist. Hitchens can ignore that offer of forgiveness. So free will means even God can't force us to love him. So God does not send people to hell. They send themselves there. I mean, a loving God is not going to jam people into heaven against their will. He respects our choices. And he brings up the question again, Turek does. He said, but why forever? He says, well, first, it wouldn't be right for God to annihilate unbelievers. A person like Christopher Hitchens, he's made in the image of God like everybody else. God can't annihilate his own image. That'd be an attack on himself. So what is hell? Basically, it's a quarantine for people who reject him. Here's a second reason why it's forever. A crime might take only seconds to commit, but the punishment is typically much longer. I mean, think about it. You shoot somebody, you could do that in a half a second, but you may spend the rest of your life in jail for that. Here's another reason. Why forever? It may be, and this is what Morrow and McDowell said, it may be that the people in hell go on sinning, so they continue their rebellion. Here's a fourth reason he thinks it's going to be forever. Since God is perfectly just, everyone will receive the perfect degree of punishment in hell or reward in heaven. So he said at the end, Turek says, so despite my doubts, God is just, he is loving, hell is necessary. In fact, that's the main reason Christ came. He uses the verse Mark 10:45. If there's no hell, what is Jesus saving us from? If there's no hell, an innocent Christ dies this awful death for nothing. So I think that's a good way to end it. So again, the book is called Is God Just a Human Invention? It's powerful. It's challenging. It takes on those questions that the new atheists raise and really, I think, knocks holes in them. So it's a wonderful book. Hope you have a chance to get a hold of it. It's been around for a while. Probably is still available in paperback. Pick up a cheap copy somewhere. And thanks so much for being part of this podcast. We'll do another one really soon. Take care.